Welcome, my name is Kristen Nelson. I'm a founder and the executive director of Casa Libre. I'm thrilled to have you all here tonight. This is the third in our brand new reading series. Nice to see you. Very, very soon I'm going to invite Bill Wetzel up to the microphone, and he will tell you more about tonight's program and more about his intentions as the curator of this series. But I just wanted to invite you to learn more about Casa Libre. If you'd like to, there are some small brochures here. They fit in your pocket. They'll tell you more about our programs. We do slow down a bit in the summer, like everything in Tucson, so we only have 3 or 4 more readings before our August closure, when we are entirely closed for the month of August. But we have a few more things going on this month in June and also in July. If you'd like more information, you can feel free to sign up our guest book and give us your email address. I'll add you to our listserv. Or you can talk to me or visit our website, which is casalibre.org. And you don't have to remember that because it's also posted on the brochure. So thank you so much for coming tonight, and if you would please help me to welcome Bill.
What you're seeing is the combined efforts of Indian time, Tucson time, and Sterling HolyWhiteMountain time. So. You always have one like diva out of everybody, and that when you set one of these up, and Sterling by far is the diva. So.
Did you get him his M&Ms?
Yeah, he wanted M&Ms. He had to get water at a certain temperature. He had like a variety of hair care products. but he's pretty, so. My name is Bill Wetzel. I'm a member of the Blackfeet tribe, and I am your curator for this series. I'm not going to mess around too much. I'll just read. I'll read their bios. We're going to start with actually Tsosie-Mahieu first, then Sterling's going to read. Then we'll take a couple-minute break, and Edward's going to play some music. So here's Edward Chato-Seaton. He was born in Durango, Colorado, by the efforts of his mother, and grew up in Kayenta, Arizona. And I cannot read another language, so I'll just say he is pursuing a major in gender and women's studies with a minor in American Indian Studies at the University of Arizona. As a current treasurer of Rez Made magazine, he is interested in spreading awareness of current Native American issues as well as exploring its complicated nature. Personal hobbies include conquering the blank page along with covering and creating songs by his 2 guitars. When all else fails, he enjoys darting around on his longboard. When not enjoying his hobbies, he is always looking to further his sales and communication skills with an intent to enter the field of advertising. Sterling HolyWhiteMountain grew up on the Blackfeet Reservation, where he lived the first part of his life according to the laws of the local basketball religion. He holds a BA in English, in creative writing from the University of Montana, a master's in creative writing from the Iowa Writers Workshop, and was a James C. McCreight Fiction Fellow at the University of Wisconsin, which is kind of a big deal. So, he is also the owner and founder of Rez Made, the new clothing company for reservation peoples and their relations. Currently, he is working on a number of novels and novellas, and is taking classes toward a BA in Native American Studies at the University of Montana. Beginning in September 2014, he will be organizing free classes in tribal sovereignty, open to anyone in the Blackfeet Reservation area. Ashley Tsosie-Mahieu is a citizen of the Navajo Nation, and again, I can't speak another language. So, Ashley is I should have asked you how to speak Navajo before, so I can read that. Ashley is a 3rd-year PhD student in the American Indian Studies program with a concentration in American Indian Education at the University of Arizona. She holds a Master's of Education degree in Education Policy Studies with a minor in American Indian Studies and a Bachelor of Arts degree in Comparative and World Literature from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Ashley has had 2 short works of fiction published in Writing, a Native American student publication, Generational Gap, and Walking Beauty. Both stories embody modern-day ceremonies and the individual healing processes of their female protagonists. Ashley's academic and creative work is greatly influenced by her experiences as a Navajo woman who has had to and still continues to negotiate between different and conflicting cultural spaces and identities. We're also going to have some Redding magazines are out there for sale, and some of Sterling's shirts are here for sale.
say hello. I'm actually Tsosie-Mahieu. And I think hang on, let me adjust this thing really quick. I guess I'm a little bit taller.
Push that part down.
I obviously don't do this very often.
If you unscrew that, it'll let you move it up and down. Or Bill, how would you help?
Help me, I'm poor.
Oh, this right? No, that's not this line.
Sterling the Diva doesn't know what's going on
No.
today.
I ran a radio series for Tuesday.
Oh, they've taped it.
Oh, that one you can't do anything.
Awesome.
You can tilt it.
That works.
Yeah, I think
It's better. All right. So again, I'm Ashley Tsosie-Mahieu. Thank you to Bill, Wetzel's Pretzels, for inviting me to share my work in this series. And thanks to all of you who have come here. Really appreciate your presence. Like Bill said in my introduction, I'm a third-year PhD student in the American Indian Studies program at the University of Arizona. And that means I haven't really written a lot of new things. Mostly, writing for the PhD, taking classes and things like that. So creativity kind of moves to the wayside, unfortunately. But tonight I'll be sharing some selections. Bless you. Selections from one of the two short stories Bill had mentioned in my introduction. Both of those have been published in Red Ink magazine. Both published about a year apart, one in spring 2008. And I moved your recorder. This is the spring 2008 issue, and I'm not going to be sharing, I'll be talking a little bit about this story in this publication, but I'll be reading selections from the other one, and I believe that was an online edition of the publication. I've not participated in a real reading series before, so this is new and exciting and scary. So I guess the only excerpts I've read has been for people in class, just very, very short excerpts, so I'm excited to do this. Both of the stories have some really personal elements to them, and as I was going over them today, it was very apparent that, it was very emotional for me. But I'll kind of explain those personal elements a little bit. Hopefully I won't crack at any point. The first story is called Generational Gap, which is mostly about intergenerational trauma and coping and healing from that trauma. So I'll read the opening scene and middle scene and the end scene from this story. Come on, over here. I deftly craned my neck in the direction of the voice to see a tall and slender teenage boy pointing off into the distance, a small bundle clutched in his arms. Come on, Mom, hurry! I turned in the opposite direction, my eyes blinded by a low westward sun. Squinting, I spied many figures approaching, swift and mechanical, a swarm of horsemen. An instant feeling of urgency surged through my veins. Here, I'll take her, I said, reaching for the soft bundle in my son's grip. Go on ahead and find something to block the entrance to the canyon. We can't let them get to the others. My son ran ahead, his long legs outstretched over dry earth. The severity of our situation sunk in with the weight of this beautiful child, my child, cradled in my arms. But I must wait here. There will surely be more coming, more whom we cannot leave behind. I waited, watching the horde of hooves and legs creep closer. I peered into the face of my daughter and defiantly glared back up at the moving mass of limbs. Mom, I found some things and set them near the path. We have to go now. This is it. No more are coming. No, we can't just leave yet. Shema, he caught my attention. They are dead, and we will end up like them if we don't go now. I gazed into his deep brown eyes, pools of love and bravery despite his harsh tone. My heart sank as I gave in to my son's pleas. We turned to sprint toward the canyon's entrance. As we did, a loud blast rang out in the distance, and a small, speedy glint of metal shot through the air. My son collapsed, and I shifted my bundle and bent down to help him to his feet. He wouldn't move. I shook his body, trying to get him to display any sign of life. I finally discovered the blood spreading through his jet black hair. Dark red ooze spilled down his neck in little streams and collected around his head. The dry dirt thirstily absorbed the blood of my son. Touching his head, his wound, his blood, a cry that began in my belly and rose to my heart and through my throat escaped out my lips. I turned toward his murderers, and hatred flooded my body. More gunshots fired out, and bullets rained down around me. What cowards shooting at a woman and a newborn child? Watching them edge nearer, I glanced left and right, searching for a means of escape. I peeked over my shoulder, a breeze hitting the back of my ear. Come here, the lure of the canyon. More bullets rang out. I turned to face the mouth of the canyon. I walked up to the ledge, the little bundle in my arms. I can't let them have us. They will not have the satisfaction. I kissed the little face peering out from the blankets. I can't let them have you. Taking a few steps back, I closed my eyes, inhaling deep from my abdomen. I flicked open my eyes and took a running start before throwing myself into the giant hole in the earth. Feeling weightless, I grasped the bundle tighter until the baby let out a gasp, and then black. I opened my eyes to see a beige carpet a couple feet below me. Whoa, I stammered as I kept my balance on the bed. I rolled over to the center, pulling my comforter around my chin. I turned my head to the alarm clock, 1:21 a.m. I can't believe that dream. I'm gonna need something to help me sleep after that one. Still groggy, I navigated my way through the darkness of my apartment. I flicked on the light in the bathroom and winced at its blinding brightness. Opening the cabinet, I reached in and took out a bottle of sleeping pills, popped 2 in my hand and then into my mouth, swallowing them both without water. Pills are so necessary with these type of dreams. I tiptoed my way back to bed so as not to wake any of the other 9-to-5ers in the apartments around me. I snuggled back into bed and reached to scratch a tickle, the legs of a small spider on my right leg. So that's the opening scene. The next scene I'll read, and I'll explain a little bit more about the story, and maybe you get a better understanding too after I read this section, but you might notice after there's kind of a pattern between a dream sequence and then the reality when she wakes up. So this is actually I'm skipping the second section, this is the third. And this is the one that's gonna get me, and you'll know why later. Hello, my $1 million grandchild. I looked up to see my grandfather in front of a very unfamiliar background, a large complex of yellow and green buildings of which we stood in the center. Hi, Papa, where are we? I asked. You know this place. Your grandma and I taught and translated here. Your mom grew up here as a teenager. Oh, this is Intermountain, huh? Mom's told me very little about this place. He motioned with his hand for me to follow, his hand covered in magnificent turquoise. We walked along a path toward one of the larger buildings. This is not a good place, Memory. Your grandma and I witnessed many awful things here, and we tried to keep your mom and your aunts and your uncles away from it all. But they eventually heard about the beatings, the suicides, the murders, and now you are hearing about them. Papa grabbed my hand, and a flood of memories rushed into my body and collected in my brain. A montage of children being beaten for speaking their own languages, of children being tortured into becoming civilized, of children feeling such an absence in their hearts that they resolved upon slitting their own throats or hanging themselves with their bed sheets, of children being raped by the very people trying to educate them, of children trying to escape the horror of the boarding schools, only to be captured and re-emerged back into the system. I shivered at the sight of all of this. I opened my eyes and the whole world was spinning in front of me. I tried to keep my balance, but began a slow descent to the ground. My grandfather, despite his old age, effortlessly moved and held up my collapsing body. I lay against him for a while until I was able to stand on my own. I heard voices near the other side of the complex. I looked over to see a group of children playing on a makeshift baseball diamond. Papa looked over too. I've got to get going soon. They need a protector over there. I nodded. Can I stay and look around? Yes, but be careful. Those memories are embedded in this place. You could run into something that will hurt you. We hugged, feeling the power across the generations. This is not goodbye, because I will see you again, I said. That's right, I'll go on that. We parted and I continued on the path toward the big yellow brick building. I walked up a few narrow stairs to the large doorway, boasting an equally giant green door. I grabbed the knob and turned, putting my entire mass against the door. The stubborn slab finally gave way, its resistance forcing the question of whether or not I wanted to witness what lay therein. I quietly stepped in, unable to see anything in the dark. My eyes finally adjusted. The slivers of light penetrating through the windows became enough to guide me around. I turned right down a hallway, a row of rooms on either side. I stepped into one room, 2 mattresses pushed up against opposing walls, 2 windows with barriers across them, a dresser and a desk. It looked more like boarding for mental patients rather than students. I continued walking down the hall, figuring that all of the rooms would be the same. I came to the end of the hall, where a flight of stairs could take me up or down. I descended the stairs into even more darkness. Maybe this was a bad idea, I thought, looking back to the top of the staircase. I continued, arms outstretched to feel my way around. I found my way into a large restroom. I could barely make out the things around me. Rows of stalls without doors, a few sinks across one wall, concrete floor, rusted pipes of different circumferences along the ceiling, dripping water down the walls. I stopped at the end of the row of toilets to see one toilet sitting out in the open. At that moment, a strange noise generated from the pipes. I looked up at them. They started leaking even further. A bulge made its way through one of the larger pipes, but stopped. Something was stuck in it. What the hell could it be? I stepped closer to the pipes and stood on the toilet to further examine the problem. Water sprayed into my face. I wiped it away. Water rushed through the cracks quicker and quicker. Panic took me over. I jumped down off the toilet just as the pipes burst open, a waterfall raining down onto the porcelain and onto the floor. The bulge came spewing out and drifted to a halt at my feet. I looked down and my head spun out of control. I bent down to make sure I was really seeing this. A bloody package of flesh, umbilical cord wrapped around the tiny body. I took one last breath and fainted into the collection of rushing water. And then black. Feeling water drip down my face, I immediately reached up with both hands to wipe it away. My eyes shot open, finally realizing I was bathed in my own sweat. I exhaled deeply, my heart still racing from the bloody image implanted in my brain. A cold shudder ran across the length of my spine. I sat up, reaching to pull my knees tight, hugging them against my body. I glanced over at the clock, 3:01 a.m. Yikes, I thought, yanking the covers off of me and getting up out of bed. I went to the kitchen for my emergency pack. No, I decided. To get back to sleep after that dream requires something stronger, perhaps a shot. I had gotten rid of all my hard liquor about a month ago. I did, however, have a few beers left over. I'll settle for one of those. I sipped the beer, considering the images in my dreams. I'm not sure where I get these things. I mean, no one in our family talks about this stuff. Everyone knows these things happened, sure. The invasion of the Spaniards, the long walk, the boarding school experience. We all know these things happen, but no one talks about them in detail. I understand why. I know the power and value behind words and thoughts, despite the loss they experience in the colonial world. I just can't understand how I can be haunted by such things that I did not experience or witness. I finished up my beer, feeling a sudden sensation of guilt as I stood up to throw it in the recycle bin. I walked back to my bedroom and tried to get comfortable again. I squirmed around for a while, thinking about my dream, the images caught in the memories of... Oh, I messed that up. I'm gonna have to redo that. Sorry, guys. I squirmed around for a little while, thinking about my dreams, the images caught in the spider webs of memory. So that's the end of the third scene. The parts I left out, the second and fourth sections, are pretty graphic. I would try to read them out loud, but I don't think I could get through them. They're very emotional, and so yeah, I'm gonna refrain from reading those. But like I said before, I mean, even rereading these stories was really kind of painful for me to do. The parts that I did leave out, the second scene involves a rape at Fort Sumner, and forced sterilization at a hospital is the fourth scene. So the dream sequences jump back and forth to different parts in Navajo history, different traumatic events that women have experienced. So the narrator in the present day is sorting out this historical trauma of her family. What really inspired the story and why it's kind of personal and it evokes a lot of emotions for me is the boarding school experience scene is what really inspired the story. And it's based on, it's based on unfactual things. My grandfather and grandmother were employees at Intermountain Boarding School. And I actually had a dream about that scene as almost exactly what I dreamt. The present day non-dream scenes kind of came about after I had a nightmare where someone was choking me and I woke up and I had bed sheets wrapped around my neck, which was really kind of scary. But I tried to the scene sort of correlate the first one. She's jumping off of a cliff in the dream, and then she's about to fall off the bed. When she wakes up. Let's see. And the protagonist, her name is only mentioned one time. It's Memory, and actually that's my cousin's name. So I kind of stole that, but still, it's remembering all of these things. But ultimately, Memory confronts the dreams, and I guess I'll just read the final scene to kind of wrap it up. Aware of being in my own room, I tried moving my body. I opened my eyes, but still could not move. The tangle of 1,000 spiders ran up and down my legs, my torso, my arms, even my head. I blinked, my eyes the only part of me I had any control over. I strained them toward the clock, 4 a.m. I lie there thinking about all of these dreams, all of these memories of awful things that did not happen to me, feeling the hurt of hundreds of years of trauma. Unable to move, unable to do anything about it. I can't let this continue. I can't let this cycle of unresolved pain go on. No, I will learn as much as possible, remember as much as possible, confront as much as possible, and share with the ones who come after me. I can do something about it. Healing begins here, and it doesn't involve the self-prescribed medicines of the world outside of my bedroom, of the colonial world. The tingle in my body subsided, and with much strength, I was finally able to move my right arm. I reached down and lightly touched my lower abdomen. Healing begins here. I rubbed my belly, inhaling and exhaling deeply. My thoughts circulated around the idea of new life. I fell back asleep, unafraid of the images I would be shown, and unafraid of the heartbreaking stories I would tell in the future. So at the end, I sort of hint at Memory, the protagonist, is pregnant and is going to, try to stop this, cycle of trauma, or at least confront it. So that was that one. And the other story I'll just briefly talk about, the one that's published in this particular issue of Reading, is called Walk in Beauty, which is about a healing ceremony. In the story, the narrator, her name's Amy, undergoes a Navajo ceremony with a medicine man, but she kind of feels a little awkward about it afterwards. She doesn't feel like it did anything. And that's indicated by this encounter she has with a Blani, a drunk woman at a gas station on the Rez. So she decides to undergo her own individual ceremony that involves running down Canyon de Chelly, which is something that kind of takes her back to her youth as well. So at the end, Amy she feels ready to reconnect with the beauty way of life, and to discontinue an unhealthy lifestyle she was living beforehand. So if you're interested, check it out. The magazine's up here. And I guess I think I'm running out of time here, but yes, I am. The last thing I want to share is it's an unpublished poem that I wrote a couple of years ago about a group of Indigenous scholars in the Midwest. Myself included, we were all sort of feeling disconnected from our families, from kind of ceremonial ways of life. So we kind of formed our own group and would attempt to remain connected to some sacred way of being. So this is called Outside Our Homelands. East. This is how we begin the journey in many of our ways, where we begin the process of becoming human, entering the cycle as entering the circle as five-fingered beings, removing our colonial armor and badges. South, we orbit the circle, remembering our relationships to one another and our non-human relatives. The buffalo glance at us, their curiosity piqued. Tiny rabbits poke out from their hiding places. West, rain clouds emerge, sneaking into our session. Warm summer sun shines despite the interruption. Division in the sky reminds of the importance of balance, the necessity of dark and light, sun and rain, female and male. North, to close, we each offer tobacco to the earth. Lightning flashes in the distance, thunder proudly follows. A funnel of wind dances above our heads. The sacred does not exist. Oh my goodness, I just ruined like the best line. The sacred does exist outside of our homelands. So that was written, like a lot of us were just, again, like I said, feeling disconnected from our families and ways of being, and that was kind of our way of coming together. And I wrote that about a specific experience we had in kind of a ceremonial space, and where there was a big storm coming. We actually saw a funnel cloud, and it was a really like just energetic and amazing experience. So that is all that I have. Thank you very much. Sterling the Diva will be up next.
Well, I could check and see what the score in the game is. My cousin is sending me texts. Basketball game. What do you mean, what game? Who said that? Get out of here. So a couple of things. One, I would thank you, Ashley, for reading. Two, I would thank Bill, except Blackfeet don't thank each other, they just stab each other in the back. And and three, these are my shirts here. This is my company, it's called Rez Made, as Bill said. My website will be up soonish sometime. If you guys wanted to look at a shirt and buy one, they're $20 a piece. You won't be allowed out of the room until they're all gone. So I hope you guys brought money. This first thing, I don't know if I'm going to read more than one or not. It depends on how long. I'm always in a world of short people. I can't stand this. This first one is called Tribal Politics. I don't know if I'll read another one. It depends on how quickly we get through this one. And I might go over. I don't know. What do you think? I got about 45 pages here in 6-point font. During the spring of 19, X was fired from his position at Blackfeet tribal housing located on the east edge of Old Low Rent. You know, that one building across from that one family. While no official reason was offered for the firing, rumor had it, confirmed by Y, that X had been fired for embezzling federal dollars. An opposing rumor, confirmed by O, had it that X had been fired because he himself had hard evidence that Z, the director of tribal housing, had not only been embezzling funds but was involved in the selling of various illegal substances, which, as was noted by O's mother in conversation with G's mother while the two of them sat at the Junction Drive-In at the intersection of Highways 2 and 469 at the west edge of LaFleur, where if you wanted to, you could hang out and learn everything you ever wanted to know about Blackfeet anything. That's where you would go. Well, O's mom stated that it was common knowledge in the community that Z not only dealt in illicit drugs, but had a penchant for getting young and beautiful women hooked on whatever they preferred to be hooked on, and then used those girls towards various sexual ends. At which point G's mom shook her head and said, "God, that's just terrible, isn't it?" O's mom nodded her head, and the two of them were quiet for a moment, which, if you know them, is no small thing. The only sound from their corner of the restaurant was the sound of G's mom stirring the ice in her iced tea over and over. What was not said between them was that one of these girls, rumored to be involved in Z's doings, we'll call them, was G's mom's niece, a pretty girl who up until lately had great grades and walked a straight road, as they say. Following initial community reports exchanged among the women who kept the Moxton Telegraph going, A stepped in to confirm that X was telling the truth. Proponents of this version of the story noted that A was a man known for having an unbreakable relationship to the truth. Opponents dismissed this version of the story on the grounds that A used to play basketball with X in independent tournaments all the time back in the 70s and 80s, which was apparently enough evidence for those generally in Z's camp. When confronted with this fact in front of the post office in downtown on the floor by one of Z's pals, A responded that yes, he had played with X quite a bit in the 70s and 80s, and even though that fucker would never pass the ball, he was still a good guy, and A knew him to be an honest man. This exchange resulted in a fistfight that witnesses deemed a draw, although some believe that in the case of a decision, A would have won given the fact that he had temporarily headlocked Z's pal and busted him in the face a few times real good. A few days later, Z overheard G telling P that while he had no reason to disbelieve X, he neither had any particular reason to believe X, and though he knew a thing or two about Z, he felt the same. Thus, all things being equal, G would wait and see what happened, because you know how people are on this reservation. They really like to gossip. Even the men around here gossip like old hens, for Christ's sake. P responded that she had no reason to believe anything O said, as O was not only related to X, but the two of them had grown up together and were raised like brothers by a mutual auntie. Still later, R was overheard talking with T at the bingo hall regarding corruption in the tribal government generally, and she stated that this was just more of the same BS that had been taking place since the advent of the IRA in 1935 and the creation of the tribal council. She said the council had been comprised of thieves since the beginning, being that Z is the nephew of U, who at the time was tribal chairman, and whose own dad and grandpa had been on the council before him. And since it was common knowledge they were all goddamn cattle thieves of the highest order, then it was obvious what was going on here. F responded these issues would not be solved until the tribe was truly a sovereign nation, and not this quasi-sovereign thing or whatever it was today. To which R said the worst thing that could happen for the tribe was to be truly sovereign, as next thing you know, people opposed to the tribal government would be disappearing, and those who didn't disappear would be exiled to America for sure. The next morning, D was cruising the floor with L, who had been his main man, and also his cousin, since the beginning. L, in fact, growing up, had spent so much time at D's house, mostly because his dad had a thing for beating his mom whenever he got drunk, which was often enough that L eventually just thought of his auntie, D's mom, as his mom too. And he ate over there most days and slept there most days, and he and D would walk to school most days. And outside of that one time when his dad showed up blacked out and drug L out of D's house, proclaiming loudly to anyone who would listen that L was his boy. Well, outside of that moment, L's parents were decent enough to know that L had a better life across town with his cousin, and so they let that family be his family. So these two were cruising the floor, just driving around talking about things all and sundry Blackfeet related, providing humorous commentary for one another about everything they saw, from dogs to homeless people to that one guy they always saw driving in his little car, the guy with the big head that seemed to take up the whole windshield, because that's how you get through this life. You laugh to forget. Also, the two of them were stoned as fuck, man. Seriously blazed, like teasing each other about looking like Chinamen stoned, which not only made things funnier for them, but also would have made things funnier for anyone not stoned who happened to be around at the time. It is worth noting, is it not, that stoned people are funny to sober people, albeit in that laughing at you and not with you sort of way. But drunk people are never funny to sober people, and a lot of the time they're not even funny to each other. And that drunk people have a tendency to kill themselves and sometimes other people, whereas stoned people tend to boost the local fast food economy if they can get off the couch. So D and L were talking about this and that, and at some point they headed north out of town because D just wanted to get out onto the open prairie and get some air. I didn't think I'd offend anybody that quickly. And about halfway out to the big curve by Kings Hill, they drove by the entrance to Z's ranch, which he had only purchased the year before from a non-Indian farmer's kids after the farmer died. Purchased their mutual cousin H said with money stolen from tribal coffers, a true fact he had heard from his mother, J. L wondered aloud if the stories about the coked-out orgies that took place in the deepest hours of the night on Z's ranch were true. He also wondered if the rumors about certain members of the tribal police force being involved in or at least present for these orgies were true. Fuck, man, what does that even mean for us, said Elle. These guys are supposed to be protecting us, you know? Upholding the law and shit, you know? Fuck, man, fuck. The thought, not to mention the universe, was too large for him to consider any further. Dee shook his head in obvious agreement at the fuckness of the situation. Eventually, of course, both because it was easier and more interesting to talk about, and also because they were 15-year-old boys, and what else does the mind of a 15-year-old boy turn to every 20 seconds or so but that strange and intimidating, but also pretty much unbelievably desirable mystery, aka pussy, of which in terms of experience Dee had limited exchanges, mostly with S, the girl from Bear's Head with the wide shoulders and shapely breasts and wide hips and broad, somewhat masculine features that by most explicitly American or even Blackfeet standards of beauty was only mildly attractive, the sort of girl who in days of yore might have been described as handsome. But there was something about her that just set men of all ages up like bowling pins, the softness about her, and an invitational kindness that said that here was sanctuary, here for a while you will forget. Of course, S, being that she was all of 16, had no knowledge of what it was about her that brought men calling. She just knew they wanted her, and that when they were done with her, they did not come back until they wanted her again. One of these men was her uncle. The question arises as to whether or not it is possible to know yourself in any way outside of how others have treated you. The narrator now proposes an answer, that in the beginning we are nothing but what others have shown us to ourselves to be. Later on there's a chance to become something else, the result of that miraculous, when you think about it, process usually we just call becoming ourselves. But of course becoming ourselves involves gaining distance on how others have treated us our whole lives. Breaking social gravity is no small thing. You must be willing to be utterly alone even among friends. Most of us never quite pull it off. There is greatness in the task, and most of us are not interested in greatness as much as we are interested in pleasure and belonging. Outside of those few times with S, where he had gotten to the point of having her naked in front of him, at which point he not only didn't know what to do, but also was terrified by her ease with him. He could tell she knew what was supposed to happen at that point, and he didn't, so he never went any further, even though she had said nothing, and told him to just lie next to her. There was nothing wrong. There was clearly something wrong, because he was supposed to know what to do, and he didn't. So instead, that last time he saw her, he beat off in front of her, or tried to, the end of which situation was him walking out of her bedroom so ashamed that he would not find himself inside a woman until he was out of high school and away from the reservation. Whereas his main man, L, had actually had sex, albeit 2 years earlier when he was 13, and it had been, although he didn't know this, only an omniscient narrator can know this, equally as dissatisfying and disturbing as Dee's experience with S. He had hooked up, as the kids say these days, with Dee's daughter in a van behind the old middle school near the housing project Blackfeet referred to as Dallas, for no reason the narrator, or anyone else for that matter, can identify. The origins of the nickname are lost to the historical record. He had come inside her, and then for the next few months, whenever he saw her, she would tease him that she was pregnant, like it was no big thing, which was enough to scare him off of women for a good while. Well, super funny. Well, at least until F arrived from one of those reservations in the Dakotas, a girl who shawl danced like gravity was less important than beauty, a few months after the time of this story. Point being that D and L's visions of the orgies took place or didn't take place on Z's ranch were fraught with fear and curiosity and a general mood of deep apprehension, all of which, if we were to describe this in cartoon terms, would add up to a large, bubbly question mark over each of their heads, although neither ever revealed this to the other. Instead, they talked about which girls they would want to be there if at some point the two of them ended up at one of these orgies, and played a game that essentially involved choosing the lesser of two evils, where one would say so-and-so or so-and-so, and the other would say, after a long moment of serious consideration, well, are we talking about so-and-so before or after she got with M? And are we talking about so-and-so now or how she looked at the start of freshman year, etc.? The conversation ended when D reminded L, not that he needed to be reminded, that their mutual... My mom is calling. No. The conversation ended when D reminded L, not that he needed to be reminded, that their mutual uncle, G, because of his lifelong friendship with X, not to mention the fact that their cousinship, was generally a mortal enemy of Z, and all the corrupt-ass Blackfeet like him for which X had such a deep and unequivocal loathing. So in other words, even if the orgies happened, neither one of them would ever be invited, or whatever you call it when you end up at an orgy. And if they did end up there, it would probably not be the sort of situation where their lives would, it would be the sort of situation where their lives were in danger. The kind of situation where you'd need one of them Bowie knives, hey, said Dee. To which Elle said, oh yeah, man. Dee and Elle continued their drive through the reservation at night, teasing each other and talking about girls until they found themselves parked facing east on a dirt road way out on the prairie, watching the sunrise because it seemed like a good thing to do, and it was as good a reason as any to justify being up that late or early, however you decide to see it. Meanwhile, around this same time, M, who had worked in the meat department at Tony's Discount Grocery for well over a decade, found himself considering the state of his tribe while standing at the saw in the back room cutting ribeye steaks for V, who was an incumbent for at least another month until the first round of tribal elections. What was this world, such that councilmen gave themselves raises on what seemed to be a yearly basis and bought over $100 worth of ribeye steaks for a barbecue that would involve themselves and their goons, while his auntie still came in once a week to buy the cheapest stew meat she could buy so as to buy as much as possible so she could feed as many visitors as possible, because even though she lived alone, she was never alone. People were always coming to her house to visit and eat, and one of those people was himself a few evenings a week. He would sit down and eat stew and bannock bread and listen to what she had learned since his last visit. She was one of those women who always had her scanner on and always seemed to know every goddamn thing that was going on. A fact that was endlessly amazing and amusing to him, since he did what he could to keep to himself. One of the reasons working in the cool and silence of the meat department worked well for him. He smoked one cigarette a day out behind the store during his lunch break, and usually some of the street people were around during that time, because every once in a while he would kick some change their way, for which they would shake his hand and tell him what a good cousin he was. None of them were related to him. And then if they had gathered enough change that day, they would make their way over to the liquor store to score a bottle of T-Bird or Big Bear or whatever the bum wine of choice that day was. He found after thinking about it for a while that he didn't care much that X may or may not have been fired illegally from his position at housing, because he had been hearing stories like that his whole life, and things would probably always be that way. He realized this was a defeatist attitude at best, and for the first time in his life, he asked himself if this was an acceptable stance to take, when what we were really talking about here were the health and well-being of the people of the Blackfeet Nation. One afternoon, one of the street people, his name was Q, although he had been known by a nickname his whole life, and sometimes even he forgot what his real name was, asked what M thought about this stuff going on in tribal housing. M said he didn't give a shit. Nothing would change anyway. He felt bitter and pathetic. Q nodded his head sagely and asked M if he would be able to give him a quarter. M did. By this time, rumor was X had designs on a council seat in the coming election, because the only way to get rid of Z was to take a position above him, and the only way to do this was to sit on the council. Before long, people were hearing stories about meetings that were taking place at locations each time, taking place at different locations each time. Rumor had it there were tough guys at each meeting who may or may not have been armed. Passwords were required to get into these meetings. Rumor was each meeting had a different location that wasn't determined until just before the meeting took place, not because X was afraid, but because the tribal council had recently ruled on a 7-1 vote that such public meetings were illegal, and that anyone caught at such meetings could be jailed, and if anyone attending such meetings was a tribal employee, he or she would be fired for treason, and replaced, as J, a particularly cynical person, noted, although with good reason, the narrator assumes, as Jay lost his own job at housing only a year earlier because he had also challenged Z about the same embezzlement that had lost X his job. While Jay, in conversation with his wife one night, late because neither of them could sleep, he said anyone fired would be replaced by the relation of a councilman, of course. He smiled the dry smile of those who have been knocked down and got up but didn't dust themselves off. His wife was deeply disappointed in her husband for this lack of dusting off. He had just kind of given up in a way. It was as though he had reached a crossroads, and instead of choosing one path or the other, he had simply sat down and said, I will fight no more forever. They were living on welfare, and she was supplementing their income by selling her beadwork, but most of the time what she ended up doing was giving her beadwork away with the promise that she would be paid, which of course she never was. But the reason X's meetings were clandestine was so anyone who worked for the tribal government could attend without fear of losing their income. Because what was also being said around town was that, though clearly such a declaration was unofficial, the council had already said anyone working for the tribal government called one of these meetings would lose their jobs immediately, to be replaced, as Jay noted again, by one of the councilman's relatives. However, as H said in conversation with her brother W, one afternoon eating a late lunch at the junction, she hadn't met anyone who had actually been to one of these meetings, and she figured the rumors about meetings were just wishful thinking started by those old Aimsters who were still perpetually wishing it was 1971, so they could pull their red headbands and sunglasses and jean jackets out of the closet and run around like radicals with a reason to live again. Around the same time, P had a conversation with her nephew I, actually more like an argument, about how he needed to quit partying so much, how he needed to get straight, how he needed to start thinking more than 5 minutes ahead of himself because he was 25 and a man and should have been doing what a man should be doing by then, and plus he had a baby girl on the way and needed to be thinking about her future, not to mention his girlfriend's future, to which he said, "Shit, I don't see anybody else around here doing anything different." To which P had said, "You're a Blackfeet man, you need to start acting like one." To which he said, "I am." P was also an administrator at the local tribal college and found herself a week before primary elections sitting at her desk into the late hours of the evening contemplating an affair with T, who had been in her office earlier that day and had on no uncertain terms told her he wanted to take her to Silver Falls and spend the weekend in a hotel with her. That would make her a chippy, his chippy. She had never been a chippy before. She was not happy in her marriage at all, but she didn't know that she wanted to be a chippy, as there was something demeaning about such a situation for her that was not demeaning for him, a fact she didn't know how to explain, which is another way of saying honor is not dead, although where it belongs either on the reservation or anywhere else in this country is beyond this narrator. The night of the primaries, X sat in a room with the men and women who had been attending the meetings he had been organizing and running for the past few months, the meetings that very much had been taking place but had not been clandestine actually in any way. They had been at his house every time. And there had been no guards or... I spilled Ashley's water. No, there had been no guards, armed, unarmed, right all over your sign-in book here. And there had been little to no radical talk up to that point, unless you call the discussion as to how to end the regime of corruption that had been ruling the reservation since what seemed like time immemorial at this point, radical. His wife sat apart from him at the kitchen table looking nervous, and their daughter, who was 6 and had no idea what was going on, but who was pretty excited to see all her cousins in one place at one time, not to mention all these other people, ran around in the backyard where people sat and smoked cigarettes or on the fire or in the shadows and talked with that indignation peculiar to Indian people at this point in time. She marveled at the firelight playing over the men with hand drums who would break out into song at undesignated moments, that is, whenever they felt like it. The dark air suddenly vibrant with raw human voices and that quick, hammering sound peculiar to such drums. By the time the count was done with, around 2 a.m., X had lost in his bid for council so badly that already he and the others were talking about heading down to the tribal offices where they would begin demanding a recount. It was particularly conspicuous that X had garnered so few votes in the Conrad Creek district on the southeast part of the reservation, where most of his relatives live, and almost all of whom said they would vote for him, well, except for his Uncle Kay and Kay's family, who he'd been in dispute with going on over a decade now over a 360-acre allotment, which Kay said rightfully belonged to him because X's dad, who was actually Kay's cousin, who had been raised with Kay like a brother, had deeded the allotment to him, Kay, although it was clear this had never happened in any legal way unless you consider a drunk conversation one night while riding horses legal. But because Kay had friends in the tribal land office, there was, bafflingly, a chance that X would lose the allotment, something he marveled at when he was capable of such a response. All of which is another way of saying the council not only didn't care to conceal their intentions, but were willing to flaunt them in front of Creator and country, so to speak. R, who had never seen this exact situation before, but who had seen plenty like it, sitting by the fire that night next to her granddaughter, who we will call RR, because seriously we are running out of letters in the alphabet, and the narrator is having some trouble keeping things straight in his head. He may have actually used the same letter for different characters, but who cares? Whatever. That night R asked herself the umpteenth time in her life how it had come to this. That the men who in the old days would have been leaders were swept aside by these new men, these cowboys, who seemingly lived for no reason other than to line their pockets with money meant for tribal programs, to increase their land holdings and leases, and to finish their time as councilmen with far more cows and horses than they had started with. While the majority of the people on the reservation continued to struggle for lack of opportunity, for lack of hope, for lack of all those abstract things we need so badly in order to feel good about ourselves. Talking to her granddaughter a few days earlier, she had said, "My girl, you need to leave here. You need to go to school. You need to see what is out there over that reservation line. In the old days, our warriors protected us from our enemies. Now our warriors must go to school and get educated. This is how it is." R.R., the granddaughter, was one of those girls who stood out in no particular physical way at that point in her life, but who would eventually become, by the time of her late 20s, remarkably beautiful. A beauty which in no small part was dependent on the fact that she did not, like so many girls who are beautiful at a young age, know that she was beautiful, and thus lacked the arrogance of those other girls. And in fact, she was lucky her beauty hadn't set in earlier. As if it had, she would have stood the chance of being wrecked by men on the reservation, the way young beauty always seems to be wrecked on that reservation. During those first days of protest at the tribal offices, she was there with the very earliest of them and stayed until the very last of them. Sometimes sleeping in the lodge her uncle had set up on the grassy square in front of the office's main entrance instead of going home. One night her friends D and L showed up, baked of course, and she got high with them, and the three spent a few hours laughing so hard her face started to hurt. Just before they left, she pulled D aside and told him without any lead-in or warning that she was pregnant. "Oh fuck, that's crazy," he said. The two of them stood there in their young awkwardness. "Am I supposed to say congratulations now?" he said. She laughed, and then she started to cry, and she leaned into him for a hug. She said she was afraid to tell her Gram because she was supposed to go to school, and what was she going to do now? D, who lost some serious ground in the battle against growing up, put his arms around this young woman who was 3 years older than him, and who he'd always had something of a thing for, but who he also assumed he'd never lay a hand on in any legal fashion, and said nothing. Because there is so little to be said, because there is so little to be said about the things that matter. He put his arms around her and said nothing, and felt her jerky breathing against his chest. When the council, whose members had been bickering amongst one another as to how to deal with this situation, this protest, the minutes of which meetings had been recorded, of course, but which had somehow gone absent by the time the new council had come into power, and people were interested in seeing what had been said in those meetings, when they had finally determined how to deal with this situation, a practically ceremonial procession of tribal police vehicles pulled up and parked themselves, lights flashing with only blips of siren between the protesters and the tribal offices. A few of the cops walked over to X with no small amount of swagger and cuffed him. A large silence hung over the handful of lodges still set up on the square, and in the crowd of 20 or so people remaining out of the original 200 protesters, Y shouted something at one of the cops, a nephew of hers who had a good heart but no spine whatsoever. He was the one holding X's arm as they led him to the back seat of the police blazer. The gesture, that of the handcuffs and lights and whatnot, was largely symbolic, as only a day later X was released from the tribal jail because, as his lawyer pointed out, X hadn't done anything wrong. By the time he was released, though, the council's most recent resolution, that of declaring all forms of public protest illegal and punishable by law, had taken effect, and the square in front of the tribal offices was clear. X stood on the street in front of the offices, where just over 24 hours earlier he had been cuffed. He considered what it meant that already it was as though nothing had ever happened. The midsummer wind cut across the prairie out of the mountains to the west, and seemed to take all things with it. A few months later, at the end of an appeals process that went to a lower federal court, he was told, despite any number of violations of his civil rights, that, being that he was a tribal member involved in a tribal matter, he was not protected by the constitutional rights that protected other American citizens. The tribe would handle such matters internally. His first night back on the reservation, he found himself standing again in front of the tribal offices. While most of the windows were dark, a few glowed yellow, although he knew this was not because someone was working, but because someone had forgotten to turn off the lights. Perhaps the tribe had been full of warriors at some point, but now, if there were any warriors, he saw no evidence of such nearby. After thinking about how many supporters he had begun with and how many he'd had by the end, he concluded that so many Indians were very interested in the parade, but so many also had little to no interest in the real work to make anything better. He went home and got into bed and knew that he would leave his wife, the blonde Swedish woman who had recently arrived on the reservation to learn, quote, something of the Indians, end quote, as she put it. She had piercing blue eyes and still fucked up her syntax all the time. She had no idea what she was getting herself into, but he would bring her into it whether she liked it or not, because he was about to make her his, a fact about which she likely already had an inkling. In less than a year, the argument that had consumed the reservation ended in a moccasin telegraph stalemate. By the time Christmas had come around, and 2 feet of snow stood on the ground, and people were leaning into yet another winter wind, a lot of them wearing only hoodies or light jackets, a large number of people still believed that X himself had been the one embezzling money, and in fact not only had his firing been just, but now that he was out of the tribal housing system, no longer would names that had once been at the bottom of the housing waiting list would find themselves miraculously moved to the top of that list. And while generally everyone had a pretty strong opinion about what had happened, only about 7 letters of the alphabet had any factual relation to the situation. Strangely, some of the people who had the strongest opinions about what had by then already become part of the unrecorded mythology of the reservation had not participated in the thing as it was occurring. It might be fair to say that those who are most righteous are those who know the least about life. In the meantime, E had found out she was pregnant again, and G, who had been with E for a while by the time she found out she was pregnant, 3 months probably, which isn't that long in the grand scheme of things, but which is still long enough to get to know a thing or two about a person. G, who had been in love with E since high school, and had somehow found himself in a position to date her because she'd finally left B, who had already moved on to knocking S around. G, who knew he couldn't be sure the kid would be his, but also knew that there were more important things in this world than whether or not the kid was yours. Well, G got hired to fix X's vacated position, to fill X's vacated position at tribal housing, and this because he was the nephew of V, who had won re-election during the previous summer. A bit of information, if it was indeed information that arose during the early months of that winter, and which may have come from W, who was X's right-hand man during the whole debacle, and who had spent a lot of time playing independent basketball tournaments with X when they were younger, just as B had. The word was that there may have been a phone call the night of elections, an early AM phone call that made a clear threat on X's life and the lives of his then wife and daughter. This fact was lesser known among the community, and all things considered is neither here nor there, being that already the community had moved on with the vehemence of the young and clueless to newer conflicts, as though these newer conflicts were the first of their kind in the history of the tribe. When W was sought for questioning by the FBI agent who was sent in that winter to investigate a case of possible mismanagement of federal funds in the tribal housing department, W was nowhere to be found. And while it may seem in this digital age that anyone can be found relatively easily, Indians are unmatched when it comes to disappearing. The agent was told by L, who had lately been seen gambling quite a bit at the casino, the same L who had been one of X's primary supporters during his run for council, the same L who had been out of work since losing his job in tribal forestry for supporting X. He told the agent he had heard W left the reservation a few weeks earlier for another reservation, possibly Yakima, where he had family, or possibly that one reservation in Nevada. He couldn't remember the name, you know, the one, where he had a woman who he had been on again, off again with for a number of years. The agent's last night on the reservation in his spare motel room in downtown The Floor, he listened to the wind howl outside and considered what it would be like to live in a place like this, and decided it was likely as close to hell as you could get. While the narrator thinks the judgment is somewhat harsh, and is an all too easy conclusion to reach for someone with no connection to the place or the people, he also understands how one could say that. The narrator gets it. That same night, in the large living room of his still relatively new ranch house, Z sat on a couch and told a girl to dance for him. She was 16, maybe 17. He clinked a glass of cheap champagne with L and L's cousin, and laughed when someone in the room said he should run for council during the next election. How close am I to being over? Like 30 seconds? What time did I start? Does anybody know? Let me see how many pages I got here. I'm going to go through this. It'll be fast. This is a narrator talking about his first. It's part of a much longer thing that I've only written the very first part of. And right now the title is called Spring, Summer, Winter, Fall, Spring, Summer, Winter, Fall, Spring. A number of things happened in succession the spring we graduated from high school. Narcissus broke up with June, albeit indirectly, when Valerie Lister caught him fucking Kendra Jurgensen in his truck out in front of Valerie's house. The same Kendra Jurgensen who was a champion barrel racer from Blood Creek, the one whose blonde ponytail trailed behind her like the tail of a comet when she rode in front of the arena crowd, the one who had reputedly turned down jobs to model and even a bit part, am I sweating? Is that what's going on here? Yeah, Tucson, we have to have a conversation about this the temperature here. Like, Bill and I were talking last night about, we had a couple winters, a couple years ago where the first week in January was minus 50 every morning when I woke up. That's 159 degrees colder than it was today. I want you to think about that. Okay, so it's an excuse, all right? The one who had once beaten the guy arm wrestling with both arms at the Midvale Tavern. When June confronted him, Narcissus shrugged his shoulders and said he guessed he was tired of her and needed something new. Right after that, all three of us received our claim checks for $18,000 apiece, give or take a few hundred. I can't remember at this point. It disappeared so fast it could have been $5 or $100,000. There was no difference. If you understand how this is possible, then you understand something about a lot of Indians that even I don't understand. Those were the first few months. For those first few months, we partied. I bought a new used tan Chevy Blazer and had it tricked out with a few $1,000 stereo system right after I drove it off the lot in Silver Falls. A week later, I rolled it, and just after midnight, when I missed the curve by Kings Hill. A few days later, when I finally got to see my totaled war pony at Kenny J's shop on the west edge of LaFleur, someone had already taken the speakers and tape deck. They had missed my tape collection, which was mostly hard rock with a few country albums to break things up a bit. Around the same time I had bought my Blazer, June also bought a new used El Camino, burnt orange with a broad white stripe down each side, a large pair of soft orange dice hanging from the mirror, a hand-painted orange 8-ball on the gear shift. She had put beauty on the license plate, I think in part as some way of retaliating against Narcissus for breaking up with her. And it was true, she was beautiful, and it was true, I believed it was finally my chance to make her my own. Night after night we drank and drove all over the reservation. Sometimes we went over the boundary line to Blood Creek just to see what all the white kids there were doing, and to go to Mick's Diner, which was still open then. At Mick's sometimes we saw one of the Blackfeet who had grown up in Blood Creek, and we looked at them the way you would look at animals in a zoo. They were a different species to us distantly related, the way that gorillas probably look at monkeys. Sometimes we wondered out loud what our lives would have been like if we had not grown up on the reservation. Though BC was immediately on the other side of the boundary line, for anyone who has spent time in Indian country, you know this line, which you cannot see anywhere but on a map, separates two worlds so distant from one another that to think they share the same land will make you shake your head. Of course, guys would hit on June, ask her to come to parties, ask her to go out with them, all the usual stuff. Once in a while we would go to the party, but usually we did not. June had said more than once she felt uncomfortable around the people in Blood Creek. They're so uptight, she would say, I just want to scream in their faces sometimes. When we did go, usually some jock would find his way to her side, putting his hands all over her if he was drunk, and leaning in close enough that I started to imagine what it would feel like to crush his throat under my heel. One time at a house party, one of BC's football players, a big lineman with a small head and tiny eyes and curly brown hair, tried to drag her into his Camaro right in front of me, as if just because I am short and not very fighter looking, I wouldn't do anything about it. So I found a good-sized rock nearby, and I hit him in the face with it, and then while he was stunned, I hit him again, that rock in my palm like a taste of immortality. On the way back to LaFleur, I drove. June said, I just want someone to drive me around, you know. When I'm rich, there will be a guy whose only job is to take me cruising whenever I want. She was leaning against the door, resting her head against the blacked-out window. I wondered if she had ever been raped. Though I had spent more time with her than even Narcissus, there were things I would never know about her. Parts of June were 3:30 a.m. dark. Around this time, I heard from Greg Feineagle that Narcissus had moved on to Julie Bodak, the little junior guard who had taken the BC Wolverines to the state title in basketball that year. When Julie couldn't play ball her senior year because she was about to have a baby, everyone knew it was Narcissus. The boy looked just like him, but by then it had been quite a while since they had been together, and to the best of my knowledge, he's never had anything to do with the boy. There was also the state fair in Silver Falls, where we rode the zipper so many times I threw up in the heavy dust next to the ride entrance, where we walked the dusty paths beaten between stands of carnies who had forgotten what it felt like to shower, and who unabashedly eyed June like starving wolves. Somewhere in an abandoned wallet that is probably in a trash pile by now, in a graveyard of the forgotten, is a photo of June from that day, her broad and beautiful smile hanging under a pair of sunglasses that, by their style and shape alone, tie the moment to a time and place whose spirit exists only in photos, video, memory. She had a stick of blue cotton candy in one hand, and she stood in front of the battered white wall of a stable. There were nights where I fell asleep with the photo under my pillow, and in any number of afternoons where I kneeled on the floor of my bedroom in my grandparents' house, beating off, looking at the picture when I could keep my eyes open. There was the heated outdoor pool at the lodge in Mercy Creek. Though only guests were supposed to have access, June got us in because she flirted with the lifeguard a few nights before at the Mercy Saloon. We walked in, there are 2 Indians among the whites, and I tell you, we owned that pool. If things got uncomfortable, if we caught an unkind glance or thought we had caught an unkind glance, because let's be honest, we imagine cruelty just as often as we receive it, I said, June, just remember, June, this is our land no matter what. Just remember, June, these people will come and go, but we will still be here. While some of them will come and not go, they will stay with us and live with us and marry us and fuck us and hurt us and love us, and their children will become part of us so that they will be part of us too. It's called assimilation, June. We will soak up their lives the way we always have. And even if we lose this land, even if what was always intended to happen finally happens, even if someday we really are just a paragraph in a book, we will still be here. When the wind blows, the motherfuckers will inhale the dust of our bones. When the sun sets, it will set behind mountains that will always be ours. Somehow we will always be here, even long after we are not. But in actuality, I did not say that. Maybe because I didn't want to deal with anyone else hearing what I said. Maybe because sometimes a few hours by the pool is more important than the truth. The proof of the power of our words is found in how often we keep them caged. What matters is I felt it every time we walked through the gate, every time we walked through that gate with its sign that said guests only. It may as well have said no Indians allowed. But we did swim, and we did lie in the sun, which belongs to no one and everyone, but which someone will try to own someday anyway, I guarantee it. And we did find ourselves held by the silence of long afternoons among lounging Americans and Europeans wearing blue, yellow, red one-pieces, bikinis with white polka dots, wearing short swim trunks striped with red or yellow or white or black or orange, with blonde hair and flip-flops and sunglasses and endless tubes of sunscreen. I love those days because I knew, or thought I knew, that was the most I would ever see of June's body. I also love those afternoons because it was me and not anyone else that walked through the pool gate with her. It was me the other men and women saw her with. It was me who put sunscreen on her shoulders. There was drinking in the early morning at Hangover Beach, drinking with friends, cousins, sometimes the tribal police when they were off shift. Their patrol blazers parked next to our Civics and Tauruses and Grand Prix. But also sometimes we drank with some of the white kids who came in every summer to work at the lodge in Mercy, the kids who were brave enough to hang out with us despite the warnings they'd received from their supervisors. They were the kids who watched and listened, the kids who asked honest questions about us, about who we are and what we are, the kids who wanted to pass through the veil of common American history into a room with a little more room, a little more reality. The kids who listened and asked and got plenty of dishonest answers. The kids who had to listen to one of us talking about the earth and how being an Indian means honoring the earth. But in the meantime, one of us throwing beer cans and bottles all over the beach. The kids who knew more about our history than we did because they had read books. They had studied history. They had taken classes. They knew why our land had been allotted, whereas all we knew was whether or not we had a share in an allotment. They knew where blood quantum had come from, whereas all we knew was whether or not we were enrolled. They knew the difference between the Irish IRA and the Indian IRA, whereas we had never heard of either. They had come seeking answers, and what they found were a bunch of drunk Blackfeet who laughed more than anyone they had ever seen. A bunch of Blackfeet who were friendlier than anyone they had ever met. And they went back to their day job at the lodge and thought. They wondered what their supervisors were talking about. They wanted to know where all this animosity came from. They wondered These few kids, why the drivers of the tour buses that departed from the front of the lodge numerous times daily were told not to talk about the Indians. So they came back to our bonfire parties on the beach, because who needs to talk about the Indians when you can talk to the Indians? They would ask if any of us spoke our language. Their answer was a sheepish look or two, someone telling them to mind their own fucking business. Maybe someone mentioned their grandma who spoke the language. Maybe they would say their uncle could hear the language but not speak it, and in silence. Or a few lonely words like Sugapi or Pikani and Imita, and then finally the inevitable Tatanka, just so everyone at the fire, including the white kids, could laugh. Because by that time the only place to go with the conversation was to talk about what was really happening and was to not talk about what was really happening and had been happening for quite some time, and no one wanted to do that. And anyway, wasn't that part of the reason we were drinking so hard to begin with? To forget what was happening right in front of us? No, not even the white kids, not even those kids from the rich suburbs of Atlanta or Seattle or Minneapolis wanted to go that far with the conversation. Even they felt their hearts sag. Even they recognized the awful and holy stench of death in the fire-broken dark. So they laughed right along with us for a moment. Everyone at the fire shared something. We all understood that we all needed to let go, if only for a moment, together, and it was good. Of course, if the kid at the fire was good-looking enough, which might make him brave enough, I'm thinking of one guy in particular. He arrived without a shirt, wearing overalls, tanned, lanky, curly brown hair, a smile that left you with a religious feeling, a beat-up guitar in one hand and a sixer of microbrews in the other. Then he eventually found his way to June's side and would start doing his thing, or he would try anyway. Such attempts were like wooden arrow assaults on a citadel. I will be honest, those Logic kids did not have a chance with June. She was something of a racist. She never met a non-Indian with light skin she didn't immediately and forever categorize as a white person. I'm not sure they were ever anything but that to her. The irony, of course, was that she was fair herself. She was a brunette at best, even lighter complected than me, but her features were unmistakably something other than Caucasian. The general lines of her face made people stop for a moment, made them consider, made them say, "So what are you?" But there was no conflict in June about who she was, and there was no conflict in her about that oceanic tide of white people. They were something foreign, an invasive species, and there was no polite room in her head for them. So the handsome white kid with the guitar or the harmonica or the didgeridoo or the banjo went home empty-handed, baffled maybe at her explicit disinterest in him and what he said, but also by the tone of utter disdain in her voice when she spoke to him. She had a way of addressing non-Indians, whites, blacks, whatevers, that let them know she held them in contempt of court on no uncertain terms, that they were guilty until proven innocent, and that judgments of innocent had been on moratorium for some time now, and the outlook for a lifting of the moratorium was grim. I asked her once why she was willing to talk to them like that when her very own dad, although he had never been around to raise her, was a white man. She had flipped her hand at my comment, said she didn't want to talk about it. As for myself, I did not share her distaste. One time near the end of the summer, we were in Silver Falls. We were both getting our hair cut at a salon in the old mall, the mall that is now like an abandoned shell on the prairie, left behind by a creature no one quite remembers. Her response to this question was to spit in the face of the woman holding the scissors. I saw the whole thing in the mirror, reflected in other mirrors, an infinity of identical moments. The woman had not said anything particularly offensive. She had simply mentioned that she was also part Indian. Her dad was part something or other. I'm not sure if she even knew the answer to her own question about herself. But that afternoon, that question had set June off, as the woman stood there wiping the spit away from her face, crying maybe, saying that she didn't know what she had done. The manager told June she was calling security. June was still talking to the beautician who was leaning away from her. "What the fuck do you know about being Indian?" she said, repeating it several times, each time trying harder to make the same words hurt. It was a lesson in the value of tone over content. Finally she called her a white cunt and stood there looking at her, as if now the beautician would take a swing at her, but she didn't. June said for me to come with her, that it was time to go, like I was her pool boy, or her little brother, or a small animal that could not survive in the absence of her presence. I turned away from her at that moment, my signal to the woman cutting my hair, the woman with the indigo streaks dyed into her own hair, with the nose piercing, with the heavy mascara, that she could continue. A silence opened up between me and June, maybe for the first time, a real silence, and I knew immediately we would not speak again for a long time. Because Blackfeet, when they are angry with one another, there is rarely reconciliation. Instead, there is silence and distance and time, and then one day they are friends again. It was not simply out of the blue that I chose to turn away from her, and it was not simply out of the blue that June had spit on that woman, demeaning her in a way that, outside of her own father, no white person had ever demeaned her. The week before, she had gotten back together with Narcissus, and the night before our trip to Silver Falls, she learned he had not stopped seeing Kendra Jurgensen. June had learned this information from her cousin Rolanda, who lived in BC, that while Narcissus was helping his uncle Hay during the days, he was staying with Kendra at night. He told June that it was over, of course, and that he'd realized his mistake, and that after thinking about it all summer, he knew that she was the one he wanted to be with. I imagine that day sitting in the salon chair, June must have felt something like a dog picked up from a kennel by its prior owner, and after the initial excitement of being contained once again by a familiar life, had realized since her abandonment the owner had picked up other dogs. Instead of being the focus of Narcissus' attention, she was something to pay attention to when they were in the same geographical region as one another. But by then I had so little pity for her that I observed this fact with the eyes of a surgeon viewing a new incision. In some way I had known it would happen even before it had happened. I felt Narcissus' shadow loom larger and longer like a summer shadow at late evening, and June, who could have had anyone she wanted, was one of those women destined to be kicked around. There is a way that a beautiful woman can make a certain kind of man afraid, and in order to gain the upper hand against his fear, he will make her pay for that fear. By the time I left the salon, which was called Easy Cuts, I remember it now, everything about it was cheap, from the brightly lit red lettering of the sign above its proscenium-like entrance, to the chairs that felt light and ready to fold under your weight or break if you leaned back too hard, to the women themselves who worked there, the women who were reminded daily by the same work environment that was part of the American dream, that in some indescribable way they had failed to achieve whatever it was Americans were supposed to achieve. By the time I left there, I knew June had left me. I didn't even go out to the largely empty parking lot to look for the Orange El Camino. I dropped some change in a payphone near the Rotunda's entrance and dialed my cousin Vance's number. I had not seen or talked to him for a few years, but I knew he would be glad to see me, and I knew I could stay with him. That night at his house, I ate roast beef and carrots and onions and potatoes with he and his wife and their 2 kids, William and Clarice, and I went to bed tired but feeling free and good for the first time in a long time. Early the next morning, after my cousin had left for work at the refinery on the north edge of Silver Falls, a refinery which at night looked like a space station accidentally set down in the middle of a small prairie city, I went outside and sat on the steps and watched the sun come up. Then I went in and called Rod, and I told him I would not be able to come into work because I was stuck in Silver Falls. When I told him I didn't know how long it would be until I got back, he fired me. I went back to bed, still feeling good. A week later, my Uncle Boogie was in town to pick up a saddle, and I rode back to LaFleur with him. On the way home, we stopped in Fort McCormick, and he bought me lunch. He talked about horses, and I listened and didn't say very much. Thank you, guys.
We'll take a couple-minute break, and then Edward will play in. If you want to know any more about the Blackfeet orgies, I'd be happy to.
getting all the exhaust from there. Wetzel? Seen the Wetzel?
think I'm done now.
Can't take much more of this heat.